And it's Friday Live with Byline Times with me, Peter Jukes.
Me, Hardeep Matharu.
Me, Josiah Mortimer.
And we'll be covering the first 2 weeks of a new government. Yes, it's 2 weeks ago since Sir Keir Starmer walked into number 10. We've been recovering. We were at the festival, as you might have followed. And with our chief reporter, Josiah, we've been following the King's speech and what these first 2 weeks of a Labour government entail. With our editor, Hardeep, we might be talking also about how this affects Britain's standing in the world. We had a major conference of European leaders at Blenheim Palace yesterday, and also about the rule of law. Some of the things we've been talking about in our editorial. Our print edition wings its way to your local shops or to your letterbox next Wednesday or Thursday. And we'll be seeing what is the direction of Byline Times now that maybe cronyism, lying, Russian interference, insecurity, and racism isn't at the core of our government. What do we do next? But first, let's go to Josiah, who's been in Parliament for the state opening. Your first state opening, Josiah?
First one in person, yeah. It was quite a bizarre experience, quite fun. I mean, I think it's... we do pomp and pageantry quite well in the UK, obviously.
Did you dress up? Did you wear any
you have to wear a tie.
You wore a tie?
I do,
My goodness.
They got me wearing a tie.
I've never seen Josiah wearing a tie. That's British conformity for you.
That's right.
So tell us about it. What was the day like?
So you sort of rock up to Parliament and you have to get there seated in the Lords about an hour before King Charles takes his seat.
Are there any ice creams or programs for sale?
No ice cream. There is cold water, tap
Good.
water. So
I'm having some
that
now.
Was great. We got well looked after. But it's very strange. The House of Lords is set out a little bit like, I suppose, a 19th century theatre or something. Because you've got these very narrow viewing galleries on the left and right, and then at the back you've got this press gallery, and then that's where you see those photos of the House of Lords taken. So there are maybe about 30 odd journalists sitting there watching over the hundreds of peers who had packed it out. Also wives of hereditary peers. I can say wives because every single hereditary peer is a man at the moment. They were there. You could tell because they have to wear golden or silver tiaras, the wives of the hereditary peers.
Silver tiaras.
Silver tiaras, yeah.
And they were talking about the cost of living crisis.
Exactly.
That's
He talked about the recent troubles with cost of living, King Charles was talking about. And also foreign dignitaries and things like that as well. So, it was quite a strange thing to look down upon. And then, of course, when you see it on television, you hear the trumpet calls and see the carriage make its way. We just watched that on a screen, but then we heard these sort of trumpet calls coming from around the corner at the back of the House of Lords, and then of course in walk the liverymen and I don't know all the titles, but all the hereditary figureheads who come before King Charles and sort of introduce him and walk him and the Queen in.
Just a funny thing I was noticed. Well, two things actually. One is the Attorney General gives the speech. This is now
Shabana
Mahmood, and she has to walk backwards or something.
That's right.
But one other thing I noticed when they go back to the Commons, I think, then they debate it in the Commons, was there's quite a lot of affability between the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, formerly Deputy Dowden of the Conservative Party, and ex-Prime Minister Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer, current Prime Minister. Does, for all the sort of flummery and expensive symbolism and all the sort of stuff we do well, as we know from royal weddings and things like that, does it give an aura of sort of estrangement, or is there also a kind of intimacy, a friendliness about it?
I think it's a slightly double-edged sword, actually. It's really interesting because almost every practice and performance part of the King's speech looks incredibly ridiculous, and yet most of it has a constitutional meaning. But unfortunately, because in Britain we love to shroud the Constitution in vagueness and mystery,
yes.
Those parts very rarely get properly explained.
Give us an example, because there's the whole thing about not letting. That's the opening up the black rod, knocking on the door, not letting him in. What's all this about?
Exactly, yeah. So the king effectively is denied entrance to the House of Commons, and of course that goes way back to I think the time of Henry VIII. Overbearing monarchs trying to assert their will. Actually, it goes back to King Charles I, trying to assert their will over the elected house. and effectively being told, no, this is this is the house of the people. Of course, it wasn't back then because there wasn't universal franchise, but that is the symbolism of it. Blocking and separating royalty, which was previously seen as handed down by God, God's representative on earth. Still is actually, but with less power, and the elected chamber, which is supposed to speak on behalf of the king's subjects. So there is important symbolism, I think. But I think the fact that one thing that struck me looking down on all of the peers in all their regalia was this is probably the last king's speech where there's still nearly 100 hereditary peers who are sitting there voting on our laws and debating our laws. Those actually announced by the king in front of these people, we will reform, my government will reform the House of Lords by scrapping hereditary peers. That was essentially a message to say, there is some Lords reform coming on its way. But again, all that being done by the king, speaking in front of peers, all dressed up in their ermine, was quite a sight to behold.
And then if that means the wives, because they're all wives, there's no hereditary female peers, will no longer bring their tiaras. No more tiaras.
Well, that's right. They will lose their right to. It was quite interesting language actually, because we had a lobby briefing with the Prime Minister's spokesman after all this took place, and there was a lot of questions about hereditary peers and this phase one, as Labour's sort of calling it, of Lords reform. And they said hereditary peers will lose their right to sit and debate and vote on legislation, which makes me think they're probably all going to keep their parliamentary passes indefinitely and probably enjoy the tea rooms for another couple of decades or so that they remain on this mortal coil. But there's going to be lots of probably bungs and things thrown their way to force this through, I imagine.
I liked one of the things that you wrote about in your column for this month's print edition, Josiah, was about the first lobby briefing in 14 years to take place under a Labour government. And you saying how extraordinary it is that the same people who sort of a month before were championing the Rwanda scheme were now turning completely in the other way. Tell us a bit about what that was like.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And it's actually quite a contrast with, the US system, for example, where, a new administration comes in, instantly sort of sacks hundreds of sacks hundreds of political appointees and brings in their own team. In the UK, even the Prime Minister's official spokesman is a civil servant who carries on between governments. So, 2 weeks before the election, you had this same person, the Prime Minister's spokesman, saying, the Rwanda scheme was essential. Flights were going to start shortly after the election. It was vital to clamp down on the small boats. And then change of administration, the exact same person is standing before journalists saying, the Rwanda scheme was a disastrous waste of public money, and it's so important that the government scrapped it on day one. And you sort of think, I don't know, and there's also, it's just sort of not really questioned. I think maybe it's a strength, that one of the few strengths maybe of our system, that civil servants rather than political appointees. I don't know. Do you give this sense of continuity? But definitely surreal to watch. Yeah.
And do you think does that change for people who don't understand? The lobby system has been an ancient system. It used to be a secret club. It's a room behind the press gallery in the House of Commons, isn't it? Where the Prime Minister's spokesman briefs journalists off the record, not named. It's a spokesperson, it's usually a man, or has been recently when I've been there. Was there a change in tenor, given that a lot of the previous journalists had strong contacts, didn't they, with Conservative MPs and ERG group members and all the different factions? Were there tears? We had tiaras. Did we move tiaras in the Lords, tears in the lobby? Did you feel a change?
There's definitely been a mood shift, I would say. Probably right-wing journalists have been scrambling desperately to update their contacts books from, the 10 Conservative ministers that they had in their speed dial to all of a sudden, former trade unionists and council leaders who they had absolutely no idea of. Not to sound smug, of course, because my links with Conservative ministers were probably far weaker than theirs. But I think among those papers, there were a lot of grumpy-looking right-wing tabloid journalists wandering around Portcullis House this week. That's for sure. But the tenor of I'd say these briefings, the tenor of government actually has been really interesting to see how quickly that all changes. We're talking about partnership with Europe, closer relationships with Europe in a way that you could just not imagine, the former Foreign Secretary James Cleverly or Rishi Sunak talking about.
So Hardeep, talk to you about that, because one of the great work you've done over the last 5 years is the kind of the water, the culture, political culture we swim in. And that goes to the good chaps theory of government. What happens if they're not good chaps? To the press, sort of ministerial code. What have you noticed since that new dawn? It wasn't quite like the Blairite dawn, wasn't hyperbolic. But last Friday, 2 weeks ago, Starmer walked into number 10 and talked about public service. Have you noticed that's a sudden change of tenor and tone?
I mean, I have to say I have. I mean, as a journalist, I have, because it seems as if the government actually has policies that it wants to institute and sort of has, excuse me, it has hit the ground running. And I think a lot of what characterized, especially, I mean, the past 2 years, I mean, we've talked about it in news meetings, there wasn't really much coming out in terms of policies or announcements or anything substantive. There was a lot of big rhetoric about big schemes like Rwanda, or this speech, who remembers Rishi Sunak's big speech on extremism held outside Downing Street one evening? So these big things would happen and there was no follow through. It wasn't really clear. It was mainly, it seemed, for the headlines in the Telegraph and the Times and the Daily Mail and the Express. But I have to say, as a journalistically, there is a complete change in that I think there's a seriousness. Sonia Pannell, in her column in the print edition, calls
Get it in the shops.
Get it in the shops, calls it a new seriousness.
Yes.
And I think there is that tone does seem to be there, and there aren't any big culture war announcements or things that sort of just seem as flashpoints for the media. It really does seem like, the King's Speech was full of policy proposals, and then it's been quite quiet, as it should be, in that it seems like people are in Parliament and getting used to their new roles and getting on with it. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't be sort of constant media storms about very small things that aren't of any relevance to people's lives. So I think there has been a change in tone, and I think it's a small positive step in the right direction.
Before we get to the King's Speech, I mean, a lot has actually happened, hasn't it? The weird thing is, in this quiet way, legislation cancelling the Rwanda scheme, wind turbines on land, the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Obviously, we had slightly separately the COVID inquiry. Actually, in this last 2 weeks, a lot of legislation has happened, and obviously these meetings with Europe. Do you think that is actually going to journalists are going to have to adapt? Because if you're at the Telegraph, there's many going on about culture wars and, how you teach history. They're actually missing out on a lot of quite small, the land, the planning applications. There are all kinds of things the government can do before these bills happen. And they seem to do them without briefing in advance. They're on these huge front pages. That they just seem to happen like government used to happen.
I think my impression is that the newspapers are still getting their head round how to navigate a Labour government with a very significant majority that doesn't seem to want to play that game that you're describing, Peter, which isn't just, that's not to say that the Labour administration doesn't care at all what its relationship with the media is like, and in particular the sort of right-leaning newspapers. But I think there is this notion of, you do the headlines you want.
Yes.
We've got an agenda and we're going to start to get on with it. Yeah. I think that the Labour government is aware that the stakes are really quite high. We've talked before about, and a lot of our columnists and a lot of our print edition for this month explores this notion of, there are darker forces that are coming up. We've seen it in parts of Europe. We're definitely seeing it in America, and we'll come on to that. So the stakes are really high. Keir Starmer has to come in and have an agenda and start delivering on it. It's not all going to happen immediately, but he has to start. And I really think that is the focus. And it is interesting, if you go on the Daily Mail website, or, it's like, it's my job to do that. It's sort of the political stories that you find, they're not sort of on the very big front page. They're kind of further down. There's a few digs at sort of David Lammy and Keir Starmer and things like this.
Angela Rayner is
Angela Rayner, she has been on the front page.
Yeah.
But in general, there isn't a sense that there is much to criticize at the moment and turn into a culture war, particularly with regards to what Labour's doing. It's only been 2 weeks, but I think they're very much navigating that relationship. And so in a way, the media is a big part of what we do here at Byline Times, scrutinizing the established press. I think, we're obviously waiting and watching, but there are signs that maybe that merger we talked about so much under the Conservative governments of the political and the media class, I think that is starting to shift. And what I hope for is that the Labour administration, whatever comes its way, will not focus on the headlines and say, write what you want about us. If we can get to changing people's lives, that will be more important for our democracy, for our politics, for our country than anything you might say. Let's see what happens. But the early indications are sort of positive, I think.
I mean, there's much more in the paper, by the way, about what happens if Starmer fails, that we have the threat of the far right in Europe and America and how urgent. And I think one of the things that emerged in conversation with our great diarist, Peter Oborne, is he, contrasted this sort of notion of public service, which Starmer had announced actually while at the festival, with what happened under Blair, because we know that Tony Blair had flown out to see Rupert Murdoch 3 years before the election, needed the Sun's endorsement, or felt he did, soon would become godfather to Rupert Murdoch's children. There was a very close relationship between big media owners and the Labour government, which we don't quite see. Starmer didn't do any deals with the Sun about a Leveson 2, did he? He didn't. He got a kind of reluctant endorsement about changing the manager of the team from the Sun, and a non-endorsement from the Times. So he doesn't owe them anything. And I just think we should maybe ponder a bit. I mean, this is all drawing on history, my sense of history rather than my memory. This is a more left-wing government than Blair in some ways. I mean, part of their key plank, isn't it, is to nationalise the rail. Somebody actually said it's closer to the Wilson administration than anything. I don't know what your feelings about that.
I think it's Labour often feel that to be elected, they have to present left-wing ideas through a very right-wing framing, or certainly more conservative framing than what they think the public is prepared for. But I think, if you take the overall substance of what Labour has done so far, what the government has done so far, I should say, pushing through bills on rail nationalisation, launching basically a national wealth fund, launching a publicly owned energy company, GB Energy. Actually, there's another publicly owned energy development that I think is also going to happen, which is they're ramping up the powers of the Crown Estate. So all that money, most of that money goes to the Treasury, allowing them to invest in renewable energies as well, borrow to invest. So another way of doing these left-wing ideas through the back door and with a sort of royalist crown on. But they are. I think people have been very surprised to see a government make promises and then start to deliver on them quite quickly. I don't think people have been very used to that. So expectations were very low going in. I think Labour probably helped to lower those expectations. And when the expectations are so low, it is quite easy, it turns out, to meet them. But I think, giving them credit, they have gone and, they had a plan. They've been preparing for government for, if not 14 years, then certainly 4 years, and have started cracking on with it. So I think that he's probably going to enjoy a bit of a bounce, Keir Starmer, I imagine, from the fact that people are so unused to government seeming to function like this.
And also, you do have the incumbency effect, don't you? He can control the media much more effectively by press statements. He will get a fairer representation, I imagine, on television than a leader of opposition. And just before we go, it'd be good to drill down a little bit more on the King's Speech, but just things that can be done without, legislation. On foreign affairs, we'll get to Europe in a moment, but certainly when it comes to the Israel-Gaza war, two things they've done, very heavily criticised, especially early in the conflict. Keir Starmer saying things about Israel had the right to refuse water and food to the Palestinians in Gaza. But two things, I think they withdrawn an objection to the potential warrant, International Criminal Court, on Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli leader. They've also today, haven't they, returned funding to the relief agency, which was stopped under allegations turned out to be false, that there were a lot of Hamas members in the UN Relief Agency. And so these are quite easy wins, or rather give the impression, which is often builds distrust in politics. I don't know if you've seen it, Hardeep, but one of the things that goes around, beyond them, they're all the same, right? Which we've talked about in our editorial, and that is a moral abnegation, because morality is saying, well, that's slightly better or worse than that. This uniparty idea, have you seen it? Particularly plays on the kind of QAnon reform right. They call it a uniparty. They're just the same. They're all sponsored by the World Education Economic Forum, and all these weird ideas that there's this huge conspiracy, is everybody the same. And there are these sort of subtle distinctions being made with the last government. And we talk a lot about this in the editorial, isn't it? It's about rebuilding trust that, that politics still matters.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that is the central mission, as well as improving people's lives and picking up the pieces from the 14 years that we've just had. I think that is the central mission. And I think it is something that we should be positive about, because often we talk about erosion of democracy and faith and trust in politics. And it's such a big thing. It's such a big concept to get your head around. Where do you even begin with that? And granted, there's a massive task ahead. There's no guarantee that the Starmer administration is going to succeed on that. But it's almost as if they've said, well, where we're going to begin is in the very small data, the bread and butter of what politics is. And it's not about big headlines and big announcements. And it's not about us.
Yeah,
it's about policies that can change people's lives. And I think that's mirrored in this approach early days with the media, because it seems as if what Labour has identified is that it's not just the Conservatives' governments that were self-serving, but it was also their allies in the press, which are self-serving. So you got both journalism and politics becoming these self-serving professions. We know that from the work that we do. And that is once that occurs, of course people are going to lose faith in politics, because where you hear about politics is from politicians or the media. And so I do think Labour is trying to cut through all of that. And I think it's very clever to set this up as a big thing, to keep mentioning this notion of politics has to return to service, because then he will be held to account on that. If there is a scandal, and it will happen, how will he react? How will the Prime Minister deal with that? So he's already saying, this is what you're going to judge me by. And I don't think he would be saying that if he had any intention of not trying his very best to do it. And I think it is important. I think it's all you really have in a democracy, where to start with that. Start at the basics, do what you're meant to be doing, and hope that people see that. But of course, we know that the media remains the media. And it may be one thing that the Starmer administration has decided not to get engaged in a very heavy relationship with them, but it still exists. And it's still the mediator through which people hear about our political culture. And my worry is that no matter how much the bread and butter happens of politics, you still have an ecosystem which is telling people more generally, with a nod to America and extreme movements in Europe, they're all the same. It's all becoming about identity issues. That's what we need to focus on. And these are the threats that you need to be aware of. And that does, open a door to more hard right extreme tendencies.
Yeah, and we've often... we could talk a bit more, I think, about the Queen's speech and localism, because I think that's another example. It isn't all about gathering power together. But it's just maybe worth clarifying our position on this, isn't it? We put it in our editorial. We are non-partisan. We are only partisan and passionate about the truth. But along with that comes certain values, accountability, transparency, and we're committed to democracy, which means justice, Equal Rights, Human Rights Act, I'd say. We do debate these things. And one of the things which encouraged us, wasn't it, Hardeep, it comes out of the Hillsborough inquiry, but also the Daniel Morgan report. You might know, we worked a lot with the brother of the murdered detective, Daniel Morgan, for this 37-year-long inquiry into the murder and the police corruption around it. An expression which they're going to enshrine in law for all public service is the idea of a duty of candor. Because at the moment, in a way, a lot of these institutions like the police in Hillsborough, the police around the Daniel Morgan murder, even some of the sort of councillors around Grenfell and things like that. Their duty was protect their institutions. And that the idea of a duty of candour, which in a way goes back to lying in Parliament and the law in Wales, this seems to ally to us what our journalistic principles are. And if they diverge from them, we'll hit them really hard. And one of the things we have been critical of already, hasn't it been, is the 2-child cap for child benefit. Adam Bienkov, a political editor, can't be here. Childcare issues of its own. We think that's unfair. And so issue by issue, subject by subject to those values, that's what we'll do for the next 5 years.
And before the election happened, we also had reports of the number of new MPs coming in potentially for Labour and how many of them have been involved in or will have lobbying interests. And so we will see how that will play out, whether there's any conflicts of interest that we think are concerning. Also, we also know that Keir Starmer, the team around him, there are concerns about some of the advice and how tightly controlled that administration is. We saw what happened with Diane Abbott, who became the mother of the House. She was re-elected to Parliament as Labour MP, but Faiza Shaheen, for example, was not, and Ian Duncan-Smith retains the seat that she was going to probably win for Labour. This lack of pluralism within the party has been commented upon critically. And all of these things we'll look at. But yes, Peter, you are right. I mean, it's interesting because a few people have been asking us, so where does Byline Times go now?
What's our business model? It has been attacking governments.
Like, well, it was our business model was never to go after the Conservatives. No. I mean that. It was to hold power to account. And I always said this. People always ask me about Priti Patel and what I thought about them. And I always said, well, if Priti Patel or Suella Braverman came up with a proposal for immigration that seemed humane, proportional, and evidence-based, then that would be a good thing. I thought I thought it was a good thing when Rishi Sunak finally called out the use of a racist slur. I had many problems with it as well, but that was a good thing. It's not about it's this party that we're for or against. It's these values. We're talking about transparency, the rule of law. Again, we're against the erosion of democracy and everything that goes with that, including protest rights. We are for transparency. We're anti-corruption, anti-cronyism. All these things. We're for service and a duty of candour. So they will always be our benchmark, and we will see if the Labour government meets its promises on that. But also, it's not just about what it does. So Jay Rosen, who we know, who's a friend of Byline Times, he's associate professor of journalism at New York University, and one of his big analyses has been the stakes, not the odds, for American journalism. So rather than have this horse race reporting between Biden, Trump, and see them as two equal horses in the race, you don't look at the odds, you focus on the stakes, because they're not two equal horses in the race. And the stakes of a Trump presidency as opposed to a Biden presidency, they're different. And so this notion of the stakes, not the odds. And so instead of perhaps you can't, doing a like-for-like comparison between the Conservatives did this, Labour did this, and Labour's said that, it's also about the stakes. And in that way, Keir Starmer's, the stakes are extremely high.
So we'll get back to America very, very shortly. Just a brief detour back with you, Josiah. One of the things you did write and publish as an example of our holding Labour to account was what happened to the Welsh First Minister who resigned because of some allegations about not declaring monies he'd received for his campaign. So that's an example of that. And just I was struck very early on by the fact that Keir Starmer made a big deal about inviting the metro mayors, going to the regions. They're talking about a council of the Isles, things which actually in the Good Friday Agreement. Do you notice the sort of quite unexpected unmarshalling of power at the centre and willing to talk to the periphery, if you like?
I think so. And I think actually, devolution, it does offer a way for Labour to experiment in different parts of the country. Labour do hold most of the metro mayors in England, also obviously in government in Wales as well. And, as well as there being lots of people living there. It's often the mayors there, First Minister, maybe we'll come on to Vaughan Gething, have been able to experiment with slightly more innovative ideas. Innovations in democracy in Wales. They're letting councils introduce proportional representation. They're introducing automatic voter registration before the rest of the country. Scotland, of course, under different governments, has scrapped prescription charges, scrapped tuition fees, all these sorts of things. So I think in all these conversations, we have to remember we're a country of 4 nations, as well as a country with lots of different regions within it that all have different politics, different demographics, different ways of working. So, and I think we'll see a lot more of that, especially with the English devolution bill, which is going to make devolution local power the default, or that's the intention anyway.
So I didn't quite understand that. I'd like to know more about that, but it's at a practical level already. The legislation, for example, over buses. Now we have Labour saying that they're going to take the rail authority, Great British Rail, what are they going to call it? Great
British Rail, yeah.
Great GBR. They're going to take it back in 4 years' time. It'll take a while. But they're also allowing metro mayors and regional authorities to start their own bus companies and things like that. That's right.
Yeah. So transport is going to be an area I think we're really going to see innovation in the next few years. More powers for local mayors and local government on that. I think we will see probably lots of buses be brought into public ownership, new publicly owned bus companies. Rail's actually going to happen in a phased way. So when rail contracts end in different parts of England, the government will just, for free, essentially, bring those back into public ownership. So it's a sort of gradualist socialist approach to nationalisation. Exactly. Still big questions over what that will look like. There's lots of weeds you can go into on the rail nationalisation plans, but big picture is bringing rail into public ownership. And I think buses, actually we don't often talk about buses because it's seen as a slightly less sexy transport topic.
Boris Johnson used to talk about buses, but not in the way we'd like. But there'd be lies on the side of them, or he'd make cardboard models of them. But actually, more people take public transport on buses than anything else.
Yeah. And I think partly the reason we don't talk about it very much is it's largely the demographic skews much poorer for buses than trains and other forms of public transport. And of course, we've got the tube in London, so we think about regional bus services in rural areas slightly less a lot of the time. But there's going to be innovations there. I think it'll be interesting. I think the devil will be on the detail with some of these devolution plans. But it's clear that we are one of the most centralised countries in Europe, and there's long been a push. It's become basically consensus that it's just not working, and that we do need to push more powers into the nations and regions.
And just on English devolution, Anthony Barnett, who's this great founder of Open Democracy and Charter 88, writes for us in this edition, has always pointed out part of the sort of problems of Brexit. There is no representation for England as a kind of independent nation. So how's that going to work, the English devolution bill?
Yeah, I mean, it still doesn't. Well, we'll wait and see what the legislation looks like, but there is still this English question that comes up every now and then, where there's no English Parliament and Westminster speaks for the whole UK. I mean, I think, to be honest, they will probably kick that particular kind of worms down the road, to mix my metaphors. But, these questions about what the future of the UK looks like, I'm sure will bubble under the surface. We probably do need to have a rethink about Britain's constitutional arrangements at some point. I mean, you're going to get, potentially in a couple of years, we could end up with a pro-independence government in Wales, actually. Plaid Cymru are picking up support. If Labour's travails continue there, then that's something that's on the horizon. So, and of course, Northern Ireland, not Plaid Cymru, Sinn Féin in power effectively in Stormont, in Northern Ireland, and potentially and in power in the south, in the Republic as well. So, all of these questions are going to keep bubbling away, I think.
So, Hardeep, let's go to more international affairs on our route to America and what on earth is going on with Trump and Biden. But one way to get there is via in Blenheim, the big conference they had. And Alexander Huhul, as our front page story on the digital site, former diplomat, ambassador, she's sort of saying that in this world where, we'll get to it, we could be abandoned by America, the Starmer could play this quite crucial role uniting some of Europe together and its sort of fractiousness, obviously without the EU, but we're still a leading player in NATO. NATO provides half the firepower which compared to America, but combined, NATO is 50% America's 25, half of that, but we're the other half. Tell us about Alex's piece and what you're thinking of. There is this possibility of us stepping up on a world stage where America seems to be in retreat.
Yeah, I think even before the notion that a second Trump presidency is getting, sorry, Peter, more likelier by the day.
Well, we'll talk about that.
It seems even before that, I felt that it would be expected of a new Labour government led by Keir Starmer to want to return Britain to the world stage, because there has been for many years now under the Conservative governments, and of course we had Brexit, and a very hard Brexit. And I think that's the key point, not just a Brexit, the hard form of Brexit we ended up with. There's been a notion that for a number of years, Britain has wanted to retreat. A notion that we've wanted to isolate ourselves, that we don't think we need things like the European Union, and the special relationship has sort of not been a priority. So this notion of becoming more inward-looking, that's not to say that the Rishi Sunak's government, Boris Johnson's government, didn't, for example, support Ukraine in its war against Russia. But generally the tenor has been Britain is retreating. And I always thought that the Keir Starmer government would come in and say, no, why we don't have to retreat just because we've left the EU. We can start building those alliances again outside of the EU. And indeed, this summit was for European Union member states, but it was also for many other aligned nations. And Turkey was there, Scandinavian countries. And actually, it was Liz Truss, ironically,
who said
that signed the UK up to it, which was quite...
and Sunak wanted to cancel it,
when she was, I think, Foreign Secretary or Prime Minister. So there's a bit of irony there. But so Starmer was hosting it, and it was very symbolic, because it's first weeks of him being Prime Minister. He's hosting many world leaders. President Zelensky of Ukraine also addressed the cabinet.
First time since
which was
Clinton in 1997.
Very significant. So I think what he's trying to say is we are here. You can still trust us. We are key to all of our security in Europe. And that has been important, I think, because the more that Britain has become inward in recent years because of Brexit, I just think the sense of it as a country as well has weakened. I think it is in coming back to democracy and how people feel about politics. I mean, it is good to see the leader of your country hosting lots of other world leaders and looking like a statesman, and why wouldn't we have that role? We've always done it before. So I think all in all, again, these are only first steps. We'll have to see how that intention develops. But the notion that Britain is back it does seem to be a priority of Keir Starmer's government.
And we also have a letter from Professor A.C. Grayling and our Byline supplement. The supplement is supplemental to the paper. You may be a subscriber to the paper. It doesn't mean that a lot of it's free, or subscribe to the supplement. Sorry, it is what it says on the tin. But he makes the point, a letter to number 10, to Keir Starmer, that, we should move closer to the EU. And I suppose, Hardeep, this goes back to the whole experience, and Josiah, particularly the last 8 years since Brexit, all the antipathy played by Lord Frost. You'll hear always about withdrawing from the European Court of Human Rights, set up by the British, nothing to do with the EU. But because that was seen as, that's how we fight for ours, that's how we win votes. We find somebody to pick on. If it isn't migrants, let's find something nasty about Europe. It's been absurd. It's all been for those front pages, hasn't it?
Well, it seems so. Yeah. And the summit was significant because Keir Starmer confirmed that under his government, we would not be withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, which is incorporated into the UK law by the Human Rights Act. Yeah. Very, very big moment. And he started talking about international law and the rule of law globally by recalling his studies at Leeds University. Where he studied
like
law.
You at university, studied law and understood its international dimension.
And understood the where it came from. Yeah. And so, yes, it does seem that a lot of the posturing that we saw that did take place on the world stage under the Conservative governments, it was more about appealing to its own base, appealing to its Conservative membership and the Conservative press. I mean, to be frank, you can see how short-sighted that is.
And
because
also,
there's a whole world, and you're trying to appeal to tens of thousands of members of a party in a very small, increasingly narrow base, and then the conservative press, a few newspapers. I mean, and I think that was reflected in the perception that was starting to develop around Britain. I mean, certainly it was, you know, a
we were
sense
crazy.
of,
Come on, that's what people thought. We were
still
crazy.
love you. Well, we still love you,
But the
but
British
you've kind of
people.
lost your mind, and you're not serious anymore.
Yeah.
And the number of times that Keir Starmer referred to the word maturity in this summit is, I think, a direct sort of nod to what has been going on before.
With no any element of Keir Starmer worship or praise, but it was interesting, his background as a lawyer. He did save various people from the death sentence in Crown dependencies. He does have some expertise in the international rule of law, while the two, excluding Liz Truss, who was very short-lived, the expertise of the other two prime ministers we've had in the last 5 years, one has been as a columnist, a lying columnist for The Telegraph and an editor of The Spectator, or as a hedge fund owner. So it's a slightly different skill set. But let's now turn overseas, further out west, and the alarming things going on over the Atlantic as we run to the presidential election in November, in the weekend before, as people cannot forget, of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, an assassination attempt on Donald Trump, which fortunately failed. And we seemed to nick his ear. Extraordinary scenes at the convention itself. I don't know if you watched them, Josiah Hardeep, but sort of people putting patches on their ears in sort of sympathy with him. Almost magical speech by Trump, when he's less likely he's been saved by God, which, you know, obviously God is a registered Republican in his mind. And also British figures like Nigel Farage, Liz Truss, and Boris Johnson going to touch the feet of the demigod. You feel all this, and you could say, Josiah, disagree with me. You think it's over. You think Donald Trump, and obviously Europe is preparing for that, and his vice president is very anti-Ukraine, is very kind of interesting background in big tech, and I think you think it's a done deal now, don't you?
What do you think, Josiah?
Oh, it's I don't know. I feel cautiously optimistic about the UK situation, which I think makes me just completely try and avoid what's going on in the US. But I do think, I mean, obviously big rumours about Biden stepping down over the next few days, so things could change dramatically on that front. You know, I think we always underestimate how quickly things can change. You know, we saw that when Keir Starmer, you know, took over as leader of the Labour Party, and it looks like Labour were never going to get a majority again at that point. But obviously here we are now. Yeah, Trump. I mean, it's a strange one, isn't it? Because it's this kind of very American thing, I think, of the image that they want to project on the world stage of being strong, and you can't really think of anything that exemplifies that better than surviving an assassination attempt. So I think it's undoubted, surely, that, you know, this does boost him. And I think, you know, Biden does look and has looked fairly weak, to use that terrible word in politics, for some time now. But I think, you know, just taking off any sense of impartiality, I think in order for the Democrats to win, they probably will have to get rid of Biden. And of course, with Obama now speaking out, you know, reportedly speaking out and calling for him to go, it feels like a matter of time.
Before we go to that, because I've been doing some work on looking around on that and looking at the possibilities. Hardeep, you talked with Professor Jay Rosen, you know, and you did watch, and I didn't, I just fell asleep, the famous debate. This is before our election, early July, in which, tell us a bit about that and what you saw, because I think this is where, you know, the rumors that he has, well, the assumption that he needs to stand down began.
Yeah, I think as I was editing this month's print edition, I was looking again at Bonnie Greer's column. She writes Americana for our monthly news magazine. And this one focused on, it started with the presidential debate that you're talking about, Peter, in which Biden just seemed very weak. I mean, apparently he hadn't been well. He'd been traveling. He seemed confused.
Confused. I mean, there's weak and I feel weak at the
He
moment.
seemed
I'm
both.
tired.
He seemed like he wasn't well. probably maybe had a cold or something that he was recovering from.
So subdued.
And well, he just didn't look like a leader. A vigorous leader. And then Bonnie's column went on to explore the assassination attempt and the conspiracy theories. And she said she didn't believe that it was staged because you couldn't sort of stage something like that. But also she was saying that it was just Donald Trump is a showman.
Yeah.
He's permanently on a stage. And therefore, when something like that happens, his instincts kick in as a showman. And so all of the iconography now around the photographs that were taken at the time and you know, screaming for his shoes and sort of putting his fist up, fight, all of that was just instinctively what he felt was right to do because he understood the gravity of the situation, i.e. this is an assassination attempt, which I have survived and I'm on a stage while this is happening.
Yeah.
And there's notion that Trump understands very viscerally that American politics as theater.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the problems are really stemming from because I suspect there are many, many people in the country that are concerned about Donald Trump, his character, not to mention the things that not only have already been instituted under his watch and in his legacy, the Supreme Court, very right-wing, things like, you know, Roe versus Wade, women's rights to abortion, the insurrection at the Capitol on January the 6th. I think people will be concerned about this who are undecided. That's one level, but then there's the other level, which Josiah says about the projection on a world stage of what the United States of America is. And I have to say, it's just an extraordinary moment where you've got a complete dichotomy just at the very moment that Trump, in effect, takes a bullet for America. Biden seems to be getting weaker by the day. He's now at the moment got COVID. He just seems weak. And we can sit here and say, well, that shouldn't matter because at the end of the day, he'll probably still do a better job for American democracy than Trump. But I think this is in the arena of theater and American politics. And I think that's the level on which things are much harder to predict. It's much harder to control the perceptions people viscerally have when they see that picture of that iconic photo of Trump and then Biden at that presidential debate. And I think that the visuals of that in people's heads are more powerful than we perhaps think.
I agree.
And so it's very hard to know where it will go. But as Josiah is hinting at, you know, if there was another candidate that was selected instead of Biden, that might present hope. But it also might be difficult for that person to establish themselves with the American public. We've got barely months now. So
the fascinating thing, we're going to release them very soon. I think there are 6 episodes already of Hardeep talking with Bonnie Greer about the iconography of America, about these symbolic elements. And it goes from The Godfather to James Baldwin to MAGA to Citizen Kane. I mean, there's some great examples of the symbolism of America. And we've got to remember the American president isn't like a prime minister. He's like our king. I mean, he's the head of state. He's the symbolic head of state of the whole of America. And I think you're completely right that the lack of vigor and we experienced this in New York when we went there, didn't I? I'd vote for Biden, but he's old. He's not effective. Even though I don't like Trump, I'll vote for him because he's got vigor. Now, I'm still confused whether how many people are swayed by somebody yelling, fight, 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 covered in blood. The base will be, other people might be disturbed, but I think you're completely right with this new situation where Biden will go.
There's also this notion that some commentators have started observing in recent days. And I think it also goes back to that presidential debate that Trump is changing insofar as there's a notion that he's becoming a little bit more solid somehow. I mean, of course, he's continuing with telling lies and rabble-rousing, but there's a notion that he is moderating some of his more sort of out there tendencies. And what's interesting about the Republican convention was some people were saying there was a real feeling that the Republicans, as opposed to the Democrats, are really united at the moment. Obviously, we have J.D. Vance, who we can come on to, who's been selected as the running mate for Trump. But there's this notion that the Republicans are coming together and there is almost a tone that is slightly more moderate coming from Trump. You know, he's just had this assassination attempt. This very serious things happened. And J.D. Vance, interesting trajectory. I mean, obviously
the centre-left liberal comes from Appalachian.
Yale-educated lawyer who's married to a woman of color. Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, and so I think that is another layer of concern that at the time the Democratic Party seems to be in two minds about whether Joe Biden's a candidate. And if he's not, what sort of backroom deals are going to be done to select the new one, and who is it going to be? And the Republicans are actually projecting this sense of, well, we've got our man, and it's Trump. Here's all of his family. That, you know, this is the package. We've got Vance, and we're very strong, and we know what we're going to do. And again, all of this is also feeding in a way that I wouldn't have expected anyone to think that Trump is moderate or more together than Biden.
He is 6 million people less watched that convention they did in 2016. On the other hand, they get a lot online. You know, Musk, who has now owns Twitter called X, has created a new hashtag. He has the flag. When you go MAGA, it'll be the flag. He's created all these things.
Really?
Yeah. On Twitter to support Trump and MAGA, and it's offered to donate for $40 million a month to the campaign. I think it's $40 million, not $400 million, but he's obviously supported by Peter Thiel, one of the co-founders of PayPal, and on the board of Facebook, who's being a big MAGA supporter. There's a whole of tech oligarchs are now on board. But Hardeep, can I say this thing? You know, the polls barely shifted, right? They were down for Biden. They barely shifted since the assassination attempt. What you see online, what you see on Fox News isn't necessarily what's happening on the ground. The big move, it'd be a huge move to get rid of Biden, but it would change the race entirely. Depends, is Kamala Harris, there's mixed feelings with who knows the donors, but that would, you know, that would just change the race. And there is a process here. Now, the problem is there's a process, some states to change the nominations now. Ohio, there's a time limit, Michigan, these swing states. But those were the conventions are for. I mean, it happened in 68 catastrophically because there was an open convention. But you have a thing called, and then suddenly all the attention's on the Democrat Party. But obviously chaotic, but being democratic. So I think I'm just saying it isn't a done deal. It's going to be incredibly busy summer. Just we want to make a break where everything could shift. What we do know is that a Trump presidency would be disastrous for European security. Vance has said he doesn't support Ukraine. You know, we know the proximity between Putin and Trump and the deals. You know, he tried to blackmail Zelensky. That was his first impeachment in 2020-21. So just as we're resting here, but I don't think it's a done deal. That's just my...
But it's good to hear that, Peter. And I think, as Josiah is saying, things could shift very quickly. I mean, they did here. But I would argue here they shifted after 1 year, after 5, after 10, after 14. Yeah. And people have had enough.
But Trump is a known deal, right? They did not evict him last time.
But I give you an anecdote about, how do I put it? How despite everything he is, there is something about the man that understands something viscerally about being a showman and giving. So when I saw the pictures of him with his bandaged ear, for hours I was like, God, that's really familiar. What is that about? What is it about? And then immediately I was doing my work, and then I was like, my God, it's just like the Van Gogh self-portrait, the self-portrait. So I went to find that, and I looked at it, and I compared it. This is at work, by the way. I shouldn't admit this.
It's the different ear. Is it a different ear?
No, it's the same ear. Yeah, okay, right, so there's that. I mean, this is just an anecdote. I'm just trying to explain something. So there's that. I was doing that. And then there was the Daily Mail released some sort of leaked recording between Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And Donald Trump talking after the assassination attempt. And he asked him what it was like with the bullet going past him so close. And Trump said, it was like the world's largest mosquito.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Why am I saying this? What I'm trying to say is these things are memorable, they're iconic, they're ridiculous and terrifying, but there is something. I mean, even I stopped in a day and started looking at Van Gogh and thought about the world's largest mosquito. It's quite funny.
It's memorable. Like
it's memorable. And this is all problematic.
I completely agree with you. There is. I can't.
You'll remember that, Josiah, the world's largest mosquito.
We'll
you will.
Remember. But that doesn't mean you don't want
That's why I
this.
support Trump.
Yes. No, exactly. It wouldn't make you want to vote for him.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just giving an anecdote of how
it's very dramatic. It's very.
He's so meme-like and sort of.
And it's always been there.
Character.
I mean,
unfortunately,
to agree with you, there's a famous movie. I wish I could remember the name, but there was an evil candidate for president, and it's played by Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen, the father, Norman. And he's going to win. At some moment, there's assassination attempt, and he grabs a baby and shields himself with the baby, and he loses out. Right? So it's exactly what you're saying. How people behave in the moment, in the drama of that moment, can determine an election. Can I tell you another counterfactual? So that somebody if on YouTube remind me what that movie is. Martin Sheen, bad candidate for president, or maybe Senate. I think it's president, and then an assassin, somebody shoots, there's a gunshot, and he holds up the baby. You don't shoot me, shoot the baby, right? But there was a big moment when Donald Trump went to hospital with COVID. Do you remember? And we all thought he might die. And he came out after only 2 days, and all these pictures, him standing on, this heroic, figure. And that wasn't much before the election. It was the same year as the election. He didn't win. So we'd be very careful because what you're saying, you think that mosquito might persuade somebody else, not persuades Josiah or you, but it might just scare somebody. So we shall keep an eye on this. This is something, thanks to your Americana show, because we're running out of time. And we've sort of been debating, just me and Hardeep, really, on this. And we're both, we both don't want Trump to win because of the rule of law and everything we're saying. But I sometimes argue against fatalism. What's your final thought on this, Josiah, as as an observer? Oh boy!
I feel
get your guitar. Can you sing? Oh boy!
I feel I should end on a note of optimism. No, I think,
on an end of note of realism.
No, I think I agree with all those points. I think. They are making an enormous choice, but a lot of politics is vibes, isn't it? And I think as politicos, we always think politics is about policies, but many Americans will be deciding based on, as you say, this image that they want to project to the world. And at the moment, as Hardeep was saying, the choice looks like it's between someone presenting as strong and as Biden, who literally has COVID and is seen as growing weaker by the day. So I imagine, and I would, I guess, hope and expect from a democratic perspective that someone does step in to fill Joe Biden's shoes. And
he did look weak. I mean, that's the problem. He did look, and he'll be 88, therefore, at the time. Trump isn't that much younger, and a younger candidate. Just a final thought, Hardeep. I mean, I think it's really important that we have, especially with a special relationship, relied on America as the big brother there, as the world's policeman. Every war we go to with them, well, we didn't with Vietnam, by the way, under Wilson. We didn't join them in Vietnam like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is it probably a good thing that Europe thinks about how to survive without America always on? Do you think that's maybe a good thing? It's coming of this anyway? Because European leaders are thinking, basically, with Trump, they're on their own.
Yeah, I think makes sense to think about it. Why wouldn't they? It doesn't look very good at all. Vance, Trump, neither of them appear keen on Ukraine, although Trump has always said this would never even have happened on my watch, the Ukraine war. Yeah, I think there is this notion of Europe coming together, like even more so now, 2 years on from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There's Russia, but there's also threats from China. There's also extremism bubbling up within pockets of Europe. Very interesting that the European Parliament presidency is being held by Hungary this year.
Yeah, it is by
so
Orban.
It's Viktor Orban.
For 6 months, I think.
Very interesting dynamics there. So it does feel like they're coming together. But I mean, just to end, I guess, on a note of, I say you're right, Josiah, about this politics as vibes. And can I just say that I'm so thankful that that seems to be ending in this country.
Right.
So by no stretch of the imagination am I saying America is politics by vibes and that's what they are. I hope that they go for democracy and how to protect that. And I think there are early signs that that's what we voted for here. Because as you've pointed out, Peter, actually, once you have year after year after year of your life getting worse, which millions of people in this country perceive that to be the case, and self-serving politicians that don't care about them at all, then maybe you don't want any more of that. And I think that is so I think by the day, as we see what's happening in America, how significant is it, the steps that we're taking? And of course we are now going to inch back towards Europe, not rejoin the EU, but our alliances with our friends there, all of that is important. And I think we need to always keep perspective that we should never take for granted our democracy. And what we've had here, we've had a very normal election. There was a transfer of power.
Very
Rishi
polite,
Sunak,
very polite.
His first speech in Parliament was very very cordial, and he was joking. Rishi Sunak, in his first as leader of the opposition, he was sort of much more human than he ever was as prime minister. When he was serving, what he was serving was this base of people in the Conservative Party, the membership, and the right-wing press. Right. So this notion of service is really important, and I just want to end on for me that I talk for all of us, but I'm speaking for myself here as the editor. I don't know any conservative journalists or politicians, certainly never been for dinner with them or regard any of them as my friends. And I absolutely say the same thing of Labour. I don't know any, none of them are my friends. I've never socialized with them. It's from that perspective, I feel we're doing exactly the same job. I'm not, we're not in conjunction with any of these people. We're really outside. We're going to stay outside. And that's what service is really about. It's not about you and your connections, and it's about the readers.
But also, I think with both of you, and I have had the pleasure at the festival of hearing Josiah's wonderful guitar playing. It's not all just about news. It is understanding culture. And I think, America materially is better off under Biden. But for some reason, they don't feel it. So it's an ideological phenomenon. And we will be now, looks like we'll have to cover a lot of that. So things will be busy for us. We've had, thanks to Sean, our brilliant producer, all on his own here. He produced all this. And he's found out the name of the movie with Martin Sheen as the president or candidate who puts a baby up. And I'm going to watch it tonight. It's called The Dead Zone. It's a Stephen King story. Stephen King's been great on Twitter.
But have you just given away the main thing about it?
Bugger. All right.
Spoiler. That sounds quite interesting, doesn't it? I want to watch it. So the main thing is don't say it again.
No. I've given you the twist at the end, but it's much more about the twist at the end. It's like seventh.
Okay. It's more than that,
yeah,
is it?
Yeah, I'm not giving the Seventh Seal, for example, the Bergman movie. It's death, by the way, but you can still see the movie, even though Max von Sydow is actually death.
It was actually a viewer who gave you
It's a viewer. Thank you, the viewer. Thank you. And it's Gizmo. Thank you, Gizmo.
And just, I guess, one last point, Peter, that we're hoping to be back most Fridays, aren't we?
I think so. There may be a slight hiatus in August because some of us have to. Hardeep and I haven't had a break. But you could have it with you two. Yeah, we don't have to. We'll have to every Friday. I think we're not going to have. It used to be Friday night with Byline Times. Nighttime, we do like our evenings off. So Friday live with Byline Times. We'll keep coming back. We hope to maybe we'll get some interviews down the line, and certainly your questions. So if you want to stack them up in advance, just hashtag into, not hashtag, but you can at Byline TV. Sean will keep an eye open. Unfortunately, we didn't get into your questions today because we had 2 weeks to catch up on, but we hope to be back every week as we were back in the past, but a little bit more relaxed. And this also becomes a podcast. So thank you, Josiah, for coming in on a Friday. It's so late. Thank you, Hardeep, as always. And brilliant edition, winging its way to you, edited by Hardeep. And thank you for watching and listening and for providing us with movie details. And we'll see you again next week.